So good morning. I thought, Carl, I thought we were going to change that intro music loop. Let's see if we can get that done. Today we're going to talk about type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. And one of the first questions might be, who cares? We all should care. You know, there's an interesting couple of points. Here's a couple of reasons. By far the number one cause of death is heart attack. The number one cause of permanent disability is stroke. The number one cause of both of those is type 2 or prediabetes. Now, another question is that, so most of us are going to get this, believe it or not, if we get old enough. Age is very much related to causing type 2 diabetes. But again, one of the reasons that people ignore and don't understand their risk for type 2 diabetes and what's going on is they hear the word diabetes and they think type 1 diabetes. Two very, very different things. So today we're going to get into what is the difference between type 1 and type 2. Another big difference is, again, even though most of my patients have pre-diabetes type 2, most of them will never go to needing insulin. Another big deal, big difference between the two. So there's a lot of things to know about type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. We'll cover those when we get to the program. Just a brief preview and summary of other items we have going on. As you know, we have a weekly summary. During the COVID lockdown, we were actually doing daily summaries. We've got a ton of, I think it's about 60 different videos on specific COVID topics. So many, in fact, that I certainly got sick of COVID. I'm not the only one. A lot of us did. We're still sick of COVID. But you know what? It's a major determinant of our life, our lifespan, our health. So we need to know about it. We've also talked about other things as well, like nitric oxide. That's been a very, very popular topic, and for some obvious reasons as well as for some not so obvious reasons. Just to give you a brief reminder and survey or comment, Michelle's continued to do a lot of work in terms of getting products and prices and services that make sense in the time of the post-COVID depression. You know, if you listen to some of the financial experts now, they're pretty clear. Obviously, it's not just it started out as a health issue. The lockdown then created a recession, and then the financial experts are saying, no, this is not a recession anymore. This is a depression. We've got unemployment rates which are way beyond what we had back in the 30s. So significant financial issues for us, and those financial issues have contributed to a lot of the social issues that we're having as well. But I'm obviously not going to get into any of that. I try to stay on the science side. But the point behind all of that is we have access, we have services which are very helpful for helping you recognize and prevent the most common causes of death and disability. Your most likely reason for dying or becoming permanently disabled. Now, here in the past, these services were offered by most folks for like $10,000 and up. You go to the California Longevity Institute, some of those places. Four Seasons Hotels has a major component of it. There are cruises where you can take, and unfortunately, most of them just focus on some of the basics of lifestyle. They really don't focus on helping you diagnose and understand what you actually have going on metabolically, what's killing you. And we do that. we were able to offer this, what, 4 or 5 years ago for more like $4,000, less than half of the existing price at that point, and better services. And $4,000, again, was a showstopper for most people even 3 and 4 years ago. Now, during the Depression, we've continued to work on ways to get the key information to you and make it available to you. And you see some of the prices up here: $179, $449, $199. Ways to offer you information which will help you find out, are your arteries burning up? We've got supplements. We're working on a new one. Supplements are a big deal. A lot of people understand that you can't supplement your way out of a lifestyle problem. However, supplements can and do help. I personally take a lot of supplements. I study those, and I provide a lot of information regarding supplements. We've had a lot of people wanting to get deeper information in this space. It's always been a very popular topic. So we've done a lot of work over the past 12 months or so, organizing around, again, getting you the information you need for your health, the true science behind supplements, and how that fits with prediabetes, diabetes, the things that are killing and disabling us, what kind of impact it has. Another way of helping folks get the right services, add a couple of decades of healthy lifespan. Another way we're doing it, Michelle and Janice have and the team have developed a subscription plan. We are getting the subscriptions up and rolling. They're becoming a popular option right now as well. So again, you can see that there are ways that we're getting information, we're getting these services out and available, even during one of the worst recessions that we've had in decades. Continuing to work on the book, spent a couple hours in a meeting with a writer yesterday on a companion book, and I'm learning a lot from him regarding how to write this book. As you know, I know the science, I know the medical piece. It's sometimes the technical sides of writing or video production that can be a challenge. So here we go. I want to talk for a minute about type 2 diabetes and type 1 and how to tell the difference. And this is a fun little video that shows you the state of the art in terms of what people understand in this space. Carl, you want to go ahead and show that?
The diabetes.co.uk team wanted to find out just what the public know about diabetes. So we went out onto the streets of Coventry and asked people what the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes is. What is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
I think type 1 is more dangerous.
Pretty sure one of them you have to take a tablet and one of them you have to inject insulin.
Don't know.
Because it's the one my granddad's got is the one where you inject yourself, but it's like you don't produce insulin at all. But then there's one where it's like you produce insulin but it doesn't absorb or something.
I wouldn't have a clue.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
Type 1 is inherited, it's not in your DNA. Type 2 is from lifestyle choices.
I don't really know.
I should know.
One's more severe than the other.
I'm not sure. Something to do with I don't know if one of them is genetic. I don't know really. I don't really know. Or one of them is caused by lifestyle. I don't know actually.
One, I believe you control it with tablets. The other one is injection.
I do not know.
There's a persistent myth that diabetes is all just one disease, but it's mainly broken down into two types, type 1 diabetes and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is a form of diabetes that destroys the beta cells in the pancreas, so that the pancreas can no longer produce insulin. Type 2 diabetes is the ineffective use of insulin by the body, and is also known as insulin resistance.
So as you heard, it has some of this has to do with what he called the beta cells or beta cells. Those are the cells in the pancreas that actually make insulin. So let's get through some of the details here and actually get some bullets up in front of you. Most people like to be able to read as well as listen. There are obviously two main types of diabetes, type 1, type 2. Both are chronic disease. Both affect the way you metabolize blood sugar. According to the 2017 National Diabetes Statistics reports, there are 30 million people in the U.S. with diabetes, less than 10% of the general population. 90 to 95% of these diabetics have type 2 diabetes. But I would tell you, I'm going to go off script for a second and just remind you, number one, that's way underdiagnosed. There's a good case to be made that there's maybe double that. Even 3 years ago, before some new information came out, even a conservative group like the CDC said there were probably at least 80 million pre-diabetics in the US. And that was looking at just information that they had at the time. And that was before the information came out from UCLA indicating that once we're beyond age 30, up to half of us have significant pre-diabetes. Now, here's one thing to remember. Most of us will continue to have pre-diabetes when we're aging into type 2. Most of us will not go on to complete or frank type 2 diabetes or full-blown diabetes. Now, why does that matter? Unfortunately, it confuses most people because most people don't think that pre-diabetes is dangerous. Pre-diabetes rots and burns our arteries, just like full-blown diabetes. That's where one of the major health problems is, one of the major concerns, because people do not understand the seriousness of pre-diabetes. But let's go on. Let's go back to the bullets in the script here to talk about the differences between these two, because they're actually two very, very different disease processes. One is, type 1 is attacking the source of the insulin. The other is attacking what we do with insulin. It's a slow degradation or wearing out of our insulin receptors. Now, the percentage of both of these increase with age. In fact, most people think that type 1 diabetes doesn't happen after age 50. That's not true. If you look at the actual statistics for type 1 diabetes, that's where we develop and usually an autoimmune response. It continues to happen on into the 50s and 60s. In fact, a friend of ours had type 1 develop just a couple of years ago. How did we know it was type 1? How did the doc know? Again, by looking at the actual insulin development itself. She went from zero problem in this area over a 2 to 3 month period to where she was just not producing insulin. That is not a typical type 2 presentation. So percentage increases with age of both of them, but especially with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. Among 65 years and older, the incidence rate reaches as high as 25%. Again, this is full-blown diabetes, and prediabetes is much, much higher. If you'd like to get some statistics on that and figure out what portion are over 50%, what portion over 65 have prediabetes, start taking a look at books like The Diabetes Epidemic in You by Joseph Kraft. He showed that it was way over half, and it continued to increase as we age. In fact, many people think that the type 2 diabetes epidemic is associated with obesity. Obesity is a strong driver, there's no question. But what most of us forget is that aging is also a very strong driver. Men and women get diabetes at roughly the same rate. Incident rates are higher among certain races and ethnicities. People of color, American Indians, Alaskan Natives have the highest prevalence. Black and Hispanic populations have higher rates of diabetes than non-Hispanic whites. Testing and monitoring blood sugar are essential for diabetes management because it's the only way to know if you're meeting target levels. Now, here's some more comparison components. Type 1 diabetes, people don't produce insulin. It used to be known as juvenile diabetes. That was, and classically, that's you don't see type 2 diabetes happen that often in the juvenile or teenage or second or third decade of life. Type 1 diabetes usually develops in childhood and adolescence. It's possible to get it later in life, as I mentioned earlier. On type 2 diabetes, with type 2, people don't respond to insulin as well as they should. Later in the disease, they often don't make enough insulin. In other words, what happens with type 1 is that your body loses the ability to make insulin. What happens with type 2 is your body still makes insulin, but it becomes resistant to it. That's where the term IR, or insulin resistance, comes from. If you go along with type 2 or insulin resistance for long enough, your beta cells basically just wear out. They stop making insulin. With both of these diseases, they are terrible on arteries. Again, both of them cause inflammation. Both of them cause damage to that intima, that endothelial lining of the arteries. Back to some comparisons here. Symptoms of type 1 diabetes develop fast, typically over the course of several weeks. As you remember, the example that I brought up with our friend in her 50s, no problem, and then over a 2-month period, she went into full-blown type 1 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes don't do that. I will typically see people go for decades, not months, not weeks, not years, decades, slowly developing into prediabetes, and then some of those go on to full-blown diabetes. And you don't have symptoms with prediabetes. You're burning up your arteries, but you don't have symptoms. Another major source of human suffering and disability. This is going on inside, where it's like that old adage of how do you boil a frog slowly? We're boiling slowly from the inside with prediabetes. Now, interesting, again, comparison between the two in terms of causes. The vast majority of type 1 appears to be caused by destruction of the insulin-producing beta cells. The guy in the video called them beta cells in the pancreas. With type 2, you know, lifestyle factors contribute. Excess weight, excess body fat is a big, big deal. Genetic factors, 9p21 has a major component of risk for prediabetes. Environmental factors are a big issue. I was born as a 10.5-pound baby. Every ounce over 8.5 pounds is a significant risk for prediabetes and diabetes as you get type 2 diabetes as you get older. So environmental issues, genetic issues, epigenetic issues. They have actually demonstrated that in laboratory animals, if the father of the lab, if the father was obese at the time of insemination, the infants tended to have prediabetes. Now that was lab animals. Obviously they haven't done that with humans, but there's significant epigenetic components. Now what's the major risk factor that we didn't mention? And we've mentioned it multiple times in other places and even in this video, but we didn't mention it now, and it's not in this bullet. Aging. Aging is the #1 risk factor for type 2 diabetes, prediabetes. Risk factors, family history, age, geography, genetics. With type 1, again, there does appear to be a genetic predisposition. You remember, we've talked many times about friendly fire, our immune system causing inflammation and attacking parts of our body when it's protecting us from outside diseases. There does appear to be some genetic predisposition for this, and that appears to be a major cause of the problem with type 1 diabetes. Maybe some cross-reaction of antibodies and T cells, other immune functions between viruses, other external infections, and the beta cells themselves, just like you have with rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease and many other psoriatic arthritis, many other inflammatory diseases. Now, what are the risk factors for type 2 diabetes? Prediabetes, overweight, obesity. Well, obviously, if you're already going down that path, you're more likely to get it. Family history, age, physical inactivity, tons of things. We've already talked about racial inequalities in this space. And we've already talked about, I gave the example a minute ago of myself, a baby weighing more than 9 pounds. So treatment. For type 1, there is no cure. Insulin must be regularly injected. For type 2, that's a whole different story. Again, most of us with type 2 are never going to need insulin. Most of it can actually be reversed with diet, exercise, loss of that body fat. If lifestyle changes aren't enough, you may get some help from medications. Several of my folks, for example, are on pioglitazone. A lot of folks take metformin. A lot of them take metformin for just preventive reasons. I know there's a lot of debate about that. I take it. I have known prediabetes. There's a thing called the TAME study, Targeting Aging with Metformin. It was developed basically because of this issue, that prediabetes and diabetes are so common as we age. And metformin is such a safe and helpful drug for that item, for that risk factor. So how do you diagnose? There are antibody tests that you can use for diagnosing type 1 diabetes. Hemoglobin A1C is the most commonly used test. It's unfortunate because it's a bad test to rely on for whether or not you have prediabetes or even diabetes. One of the major problems with hemoglobin A1C is that it's great for use, but you, again, like any lab, you have to know how to interpret it. Unfortunately, most doctors today think that, well, if your hemoglobin A1C is 6 or less, you're okay. No, the vast majority of prediabetics have, with significant arterial disease, have hemoglobin A1C values in the mid-5s. So if you have a hemoglobin A1C in the mid-5s, 5.4, 5.3, 5.5, 5.6, I strongly suggest that you get a much better understanding of what's going on with your glucose metabolism. You know, there's that old saying, if what you don't know can't hurt you. Not at all true with this. What you don't know about your blood metabolism, your glucose metabolism, can and does hurt people. Again, most common cause of death, most common cause of disability. And guess what? Who has ever known when they were forming plaque? We don't feel it. We don't know it. It's totally asymptomatic. Fasting plasma glucose is also used. In other words, the fasting blood glucose. In fact, these two things are the things that are most often used by docs to, quote, diagnose sugar, end quote. And again, both of these are woefully inadequate in terms of us knowing whether or not we're burning our arteries with glucose problems. Random glucose, this is used occasionally to diagnose diabetes, but at least that is not that popular. That's a terrible test for it. The OGTT is a much better test. And Kraft Insulin Survey, both of these are very, very good tests. The only, and both of them, what they're doing is testing your, giving you an actual stress test of your glucose metabolism. You start getting the basal glucose or the fasting glucose, and with the Kraft Insulin Survey, you get insulin or fasting or basal insulin as well. Then you take a challenge. With the OGTT, it's typically 75 grams of glucose. With the Kraft, it's typically 100 grams. With the OGTT, you get the glucose 1 hour later and 2 hours later. Now, the perfect metabolism, optimal metabolism would be a fasting glucose 90 or less, peaking at 120 or less at 1 hour, and back down less than 100 at 2 hours. The Kraft insulin survey goes on for 3-4 hours if the patient can show that much patience. And it's helpful to do that because one of the things we realize is that there's a pattern where we slow down our phases of reaction to glucose. What we'll often find is that people will continue to, their glucose values will continue to climb at hours 1, 2, and 2, 2.5, even 3 sometimes before they start coming back down. That's the reason that Joseph Kraft changed his glucose tolerance surveys to add that extra time period. So many people were moving their phases back. The difference between here are the basic differences between OGTT and the Kraft insulin survey. OGTT, with both of them, you get a fasting, you fast for at least 8 hours, and then you do the glucose challenge. With the OGTT, you're looking only at glucose. With Kraft, you're getting an insulin value every time you get a glucose value. As I mentioned before, with OGTT, you're getting 75, you're challenging the body with 75 grams. With Kraft insulin survey, you're challenging the body with 100 grams. Bottom line, the Kraft insulin survey is a better test. What do we get? We do have access to the Kraft insulin survey. It's a little bit messier, a little bit more time consuming. It's an at-home test. We get it through Meridian Valley Labs. But most of our folks go to a local Quest, and you get it. It's quicker, it's easier. It's a slightly different variation of it, but we do get insulin values. I've been working with the Quest labs for a year or two, working to get that insulin value because it's so important. Sure enough, every month we'll get 1 or 2 people who had relatively good glucose numbers, but their insulin values were just way out of kilter. What are the insulin values that you'd want to see? Basal insulin or fasting insulin should be 5 or less. That half hour, 1 hour, 2 hour peak, whenever that peak occurs, optimum peak for insulin values would be 50 or less. And then you'd want to get back down to 20. So 5 or less, 50 or less, and then 20 or less at 0 or fasting 1 and 2 hours. Now, what do we tend to see with some of these folks that are having problems? Again, as I mentioned, some of them have pretty close to normal glucose numbers, but insulin values peaking way up around 100, 150, 180. Obviously, if you're getting those kind of numbers, your insulin receptors are not working well. So again, very, very deep discussion, detailed discussion on this. That's part of what we do with the seminar, the webinar for inflammation and prediabetes. Here's some other people's versions of diagnoses on this. If you look at the ADA, they'll say anything below 5.7 on a A1C is normal. Prediabetes is 5.7 to 6.4. Again, if your A1C is 5.4, still be very nervous. Make sure that you get clarity on what's going on with your glucose metabolism. Fasting glucose, again, they say 99 or below is normal. No, in the 90s, you've got prediabetes. Oral glucose tolerance test, 140 or below. Again, if you peak at 140 in an OGTT, that's actually pretty good. The vast majority of people that I work with don't have that good a number. But again, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, if it took you getting your insulin value up to 150 to keep that glucose at 140, that's a problem, a very significant problem. There have been many viewers that have commented on this and made the comment that there's clearly evidence that hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin in the blood, is inflammatory, just like having too much glucose in the blood. Those are the kind of examples that clearly demonstrate that. You'll get these people with that peak at 140 or less in terms of glucose, but they get very high insulin levels and they have significant plaque. So again, these are some of the numbers that you need to be aware of, you need to be thinking about, and that is that's how to tell the difference between type 1, type 2, and that's how to diagnose them. Ah, gosh, there's some guy there on the point behind this slide is there's an image. We've got plenty of videos on prediabetes, how to diagnose prediabetes, what kind of damage it can cause, and some of the things to be thinking about. So, Carl, if you'll do the water ball, we'll get to Q&A. So, good morning, Dave. It looks like a good O2 sat and pulse. Good morning, Annie J. from Sweden. We've had a few people from Sweden before, but I don't think we've had, I don't remember that name, Annie J1. Good to thank you for making us aware that you're here and where you're from. Good morning, John. Tocho, Dave Murphy, a chat button. What do you call it? Super chat with a contribution. I really appreciate that, Dave. Thanks to you and your team. Looking forward to my consults with you and Janice tomorrow. We're looking forward to it as well. One of the things that we talk about is how can we make that a better, more efficient, more rapid initial evaluation, get you in to see us quicker. Dave Murphy, better to be sick of COVID as opposed to being sick with or from COVID. No question. Exactly. You know, it's sort of like there was that old Listerine commercial for those of you who are old enough to remember it. The taste you hate once a day. And, you know, that's the point. It's like so many of the things that we have to do to be disciplined, to manage our diet. One of the biggest things. It's no fun, but it's a lot less of a problem than having a heart attack, isn't it? So, Kevin McCord, Dr. McCord's a good preventive medicine doc up in northern Kentucky near Cincinnati. Good morning, Dr. B. Could you please comment on how excessive dietary intake of omega-6, bufus, polyunsaturated fatty acids, especially from ultra-processed foods, may be a major mechanism for development of insulin resistance? There's a lot of information out there about that, and there's actually a lot of debate about it. There's significant evidence that would indicate that, yeah, there are certain types of fats ingested on a regular basis that might actually contribute to this. The bottom line is that there's a lot of confusion in the science regarding exactly what causes insulin resistance. And here's 2 or 3 things. Number one, we know that aging is maybe the strongest risk factor. Increased body fat is almost as strong. It's a very strong risk factor. The fact that there are plenty of people that are overweight that don't have this problem belies the fact that it's not as strong as aging. Now, then you get a lot of this this discussion and this unending debate about, well, you know, you got the plant-based people saying, well, it's all fats that cause this. You got the low carbers saying that it's carb ingestion that causes this. You know, the PUFA guys are focused on a subset of fats. One of the problems that causes some of this confusion is that you have to pull out. There's a major crossover between diet and obesity. And so how are we going to tease out fat? How are we going to tease out carbs? How are we going to tease those things, PUFAs? How are we going to tease those out in terms of both aging, but especially obesity? Again, I think you're right, Kevin. There's no question about the omega-6s being significantly more dangerous than the omega-3s. We don't get enough omega-3s. That's why they talk about eating some of the oily fish. I, by the way, am planning at some point to make a video on these kippers. Anybody had kippers recently? It's a great way to get omega-3s. If you're worried about salmon, if salmon costs too much, if salmon's you've seen some of those videos about some of the ugliness of salmon production. Think about sardines and again, pickled herring or kippered herring. Love to hear some thoughts. You know, you may say, well, wait a minute, Doc, you don't know that herring's got a major problem in and of itself. I think herring tends to be a little bit safer. The smaller fish tend to be safer because they're not like an apex predator. They're not getting as much junk in their system. David Murphy, have you had a chance to review the Jack paper on saturated fat? I did. It was a very interesting article. I haven't reviewed it enough to make a lot of comments about it, David. I do appreciate you sending it to me. I'm sort of saving that. So here's the thing. I can't resist it. I got to make a couple of comments. Those of you who've read the book, what is it? It's not the Big Fats. Is it the Big Fat Surprise? Nina Teicholz. And it's something like the Big Fat Surprise. I read it about a year ago and wanted to do a book review on it. A lot of people like book reviews. And I kept meaning to do that. As you know, I just sometimes spin around in terms of trying to get the stuff I want added to the production schedule. Bottom line is, it's a great book. She does a really good job. It's a very long book. It's what, 700 pages. And she does a really good job of making the point that maybe saturated fat is not as dangerous as we thought for how many decades, and as dangerous as most people still think. In fact, I think she might make the case that it's not dangerous at all. And in fact, maybe I'm giving a spoiler, Dave, on your article. Very interesting article, very good academic background. We'll be talking about it a little bit later. John Tocho, hit those likes. Thank you very much, John, for the reminder. We do appreciate that. Journal of American College of Cardiology, Jack, had an interesting article, Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations. Very good point. I tell you what, it sounds like, Dave, you're not the only guy that read that article. And again, it sounds like Nina's getting her maybe her just desserts, her revenge. John, last sentence from abstract. The totality of available evidence does not support further limiting of such foods. Now, you and I both know, or all of us know, that does not stop the plant guys, the no saturated fat guys, the saturated fat haters, from saying, no, that's wrong. He totally misinterpreted it. There are problems with meta-analyses, yada, 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 yada. And maybe put it this way, bacon? You eat bacon? Huge set of issues, a whole lot of politics around this, and emotion, and quite often more emotion, more heat than light. I think it's a good article. If you haven't read it, you need to take a look. Okay, Dave. Bulk of the wait time has been on my end. Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that. Actually, Janice and I asked Michelle a couple of times, and she said the same thing. But you know, the owners of a small business like this, we want to make sure that service is there. We want to make sure that we can get the services that you folks need, the information that you need to help add a couple of decades of healthy life. Chuck K, hi Doc. Do you see any value in a Cpeptide test? Well, actually, Chuck, that's a great question. And in fact, that's one of the areas where one of the key tests in terms of helping us understand type 1 versus type 2 diabetes, because again, the type 2 diabetes, you're tending to see more C-peptide, more evidence of internal production of insulin. So for those of you who don't know, insulin, gosh, I'm wondering if I should do the old shaky paper thing. Insulin is two amino acid chains. And well, you know what? Don't know if you can see that well. So insulin is 2 amino acid chains, and what happens is C-peptide comes out as one chain, and then it gets broken up into 2 chains. And so once you start actually testing for the C-peptide itself, you start getting a really good understanding of how much insulin someone is making. It's critical when you have somebody who's on insulin to tell the difference between endogenous or insulin that they're making versus insulin that you're giving them. But it's also very, very helpful in terms of clarifying type 1 versus type 2. Robert Simpson, I've heard about type 1.5 called LADA, late onset diabetes of adults, I think is what it's called. If you read the book, Blood Sugar 101 by Jenny Ruhl, R-U-H-L. You get a really good description of all of these, as well as a lot of these other types of diabetes. One of the unusual types of diabetes is this diabetes it's a late onset juvenile type, quote juvenile. It's type 1 diabetes, just like I described that happened in our friend who was in her 50s. Karen Black, $10 super chat. Thank you so much for that. Can't wait for our conference with you next Tuesday. OGTT 93 fasting, 201 at 1 hour, 175 at 2 hour. Insulin response 102 at 1 hour, and 103 at 2 hours, and 91 at 3 hours on keto for 2 years. So Karen, thank you so much for sharing this. This is typical of the kind of results that I was describing. And I'll get people that come in and they'll say to me, look, I know you're, you've heard that joke, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, people think I'm a pre-diabetes or diabetes hammer, and everything looks like prediabetes or diabetes. Look at these numbers, guys. Karen, thank you so much for sharing those. These are so helpful for other people to see. I wouldn't be surprised if your doc maybe said, you got a little bit of sugar, or said, no, you're totally fine. But look at these numbers, 201, glucose value of 201 at 1 hour. By definition, that's full-blown diabetes. So now, does that mean Karen needs to go on insulin? No, probably not. Like I said, the vast majority of people that have even full-blown diabetes are never going to need insulin pills. Most of my full-blown diabetics control their blood sugars and keep their blood sugars down in the 120 or less, even though it's clear that their insulin receptors and their pancreas are at a point to where this is, they're at that point, what we would classify as full-blown diabetes. So it's amazing what you can control in terms of just lifestyle. So Karen, thank you again so much for sharing that. As I mentioned earlier, even if you had great glucose values, even if you came back with a peak of 140, taking over 100 insulin to manage it at that level would clearly have shown significant prediabetes. So you are doing the right thing on a keto diet. Now, that brings up yet another part of this discussion. People say, well, Doc, we know you're a low carber, and there's a whole lot of science that would indicate it's plants, it's not low carb, it's not keto, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really try to get into that primary prevention debate of should it be plant-based, should it be keto, or whatever. There's significant evidence coming out from people like David Ludwig at Harvard and Robert Lustig, a couple of endocrinologists that actually happen to run obesity units at Harvard and UC San Francisco. Their information and other research is indicating that there's a primary prevention component to low carb as well. In other words, carbs do tend to increase insulin. They increase some of our other hormones, leptin, some of the things that we become resistant to. But here's the thing. I don't really focus so much on that primary prevention by diet components or macronutrients. I do focus on primary prevention by lifestyle and maintaining a low body weight. But here's the thing, and here's the point I'm trying to get to. If Karen challenges her body with 75 grams of glucose, we're talking about what? A medium to small Coke. Look what happens. And I know Coke is fructose, and we're talking about glucose, and there's a whole different set of issues there. But look, so think about that, and think about the people that have, so many people have unrecognized diabetes, and so many people not only have obesity along with it, but they're also slurping down 3, 4, 5, 6, 800 carbs in a day. And just think what they're doing to their arteries and their pancreas. So thank you again, Karen. Great example. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Jack Torval, is there any advances in beta cell transplants? I haven't heard of any recently. That's been a dream for at least over 3 decades. Dave, disappointed in Quest. They did the OGTT, but neglected the insulin level. That is one of our problems. Basically, they just said, sorry, no good explanation. Doing those is relatively inexpensive, and it's worthwhile, I think, to go back and add that. I don't think you have to do that before you see us. Let us go ahead and take a look at what you've got, and then we'll talk about it then and talk about next steps. Thank you for sharing that. That's the thing. That's another thing. So many docs now just don't do OGTT, let alone insulin response, this is what we tend to get. They call it Quest Labs. They call it a national lab. LabCorp, same way. Both of them were what we call lab roll-ups. Labs were like pharmacies used to be. Pharmacies went through a roll-up. Every community had a pharmacy. Every community had a lab. Then you get groups like Walgreens and CVS went through and bought up all of the pharmacies. And then you got these massive national chains. They did the same thing with labs. I actually worked with one of the groups that did LabCorp, the LabCorp roll-up. With labs, I mean, with pharmacies, you have the procurement contract. So you have a much better way of standardizing services. With labs, it's really more of a local service type of activity. So we struggle in terms, the whole country struggles in terms of getting consistent, reliable, high quality service from any lab, national lab. Thank you for sharing that, David. Joseph Page, will insulin receptors become more sensitive from adapting low carb, no carb diet? And they do help. It does help. As we age into prediabetes, we don't tend to get to a point where we can reverse it with lifestyle. But with lifestyle, you can basically reverse the problems, as in decreasing the plaque, decreasing inflammation, and you can basically do away with the bad outcomes. Do you actually reverse your insulin resistance? Not if it's due to aging. Now, I have people come in all the time that lose 30 pounds or more, and 30 pounds or more of weight loss can and will often result in very significant reversal of insulin resistance. Great question, Joseph. Thank you. Dave Murphy, Nina's book is great. Just finished it. As I understand it, she and her organization may have been instrumental in getting Jack to reconsider saturated fat. I didn't know that, Dave. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wouldn't be surprised. It was a great book. If you haven't read it, and help me out. Was it The Big Fat Surprise? Was that the title? Dave, Ivor Cummins recently had an interview with Professor Subbatin. He posited that the theory that plaque may migrate into the arteries from the outside in as opposed to inside out. Thoughts? No, I didn't see that, and that one's sort of I don't see how that could. I don't see that. But you know what? There's a lot of things in life, a lot of realities in life that I didn't see until I saw it. You know, I'm just like everybody else. We all miss things, but I still struggle how that could be the case. C. Lear, thanks for all you do to inform us. Does low HS-CRP confirm that inflammation is low, or is it just one indicator? It's just one indicator. You know, you see guys like Paul. I'm blanking on his last name. The guy at Harvard who does all that C-reactive protein research. He uses CRP only, but that's because he's doing huge studies. And yes, you can tell that in the patient, a large study population. We've got N of 1. In other words, we have one patient and we want to figure out, does this patient have cardiovascular inflammation? C-reactive protein is a protein that will react. It's an inflammatory protein made by the liver, and it will react to multiple types of inflammation. For example, I give this example a lot. If we took 100 people, we gave them a flu shot today, 72 hours later, 66 of those 100 people would have a positive C-reactive protein. That does not mean that they have cardiovascular inflammation. So we look at a panel. That panel we got from Brad Bale and Amy Doneen in the Beat the Heart Attack Gene. It's a great panel. It's the panel, they got it from, CHL, Cleveland Heart Lab, who have since been purchased by Quest. So there's an old adage in medicine, and it goes like this. It's if there's a panel, that means no single good test exists. And if there's a whole different set of treatments, that means there's no one killer treatment, one treatment that does it all. Same thing with the panel tests. The other things that are included on it are, that we include are, and that you see on CHL, are MPO, myeloperoxidase. It's an enzyme actually released by the immune system when it's attacking plaque, LPPLA2, plaque 2. And maybe the most important, at least the most important in my mind, is a kidney function test. It's microalbumin creatinine ratio. And that has to do with spilling protein from your kidneys. Because the filter, each kidney is basically about, it's some piping and plumbing, but basically each kidney is about 1 million microfilters. They're called glomeruli, but don't even know that. Each of them is a filter, and a filter is basically a membrane. The filter membrane in the kidney is the intima, the endothelial lining of the artery. And if you've got protein, which is albumin, if you've got that leaking through the kidney, then you probably have cholesterol leaking through the lining of the artery wall. Once it leaks through that intima layer, it's going to get stuck. It won't go through the media layer. So as you start hearing some of that discussion, you can see why my head sort of goes like this when I hear somebody suggesting plaque comes from outside the artery. Bob Bell, Karen, what was your fasting insulin? Lance, I eat sardines every morning with my eggs for breakfast. Well, I don't eat eggs, and I've been back and forth for, well, I won't go. Thank you for sharing that. I'll just leave it at that. Karen Black, I messed up. 102.5 was the fasting insulin. Oh, are you sure? 103 was 1 hour, and 91.2 was 2 hours. Karen, that's very unusual to get a fasting insulin that high. We need to check that. All right. David Murphy, yes, big fat surprise. Thank you, David. That's Nina Teicholz's book that we're talking about. Chuck K. Professor Saban posited that LDL migrates to the intima through the veins. Oh, that's a very interesting position. Paul Ridker, thank you. How many times have I talked about Paul Ridker? Paul Ridker and his friend Kevin Blake, I think it was, were a couple of the guys that originally started bringing up this point. They noticed that, and statin haters, just close your ears for a minute. They noticed this early on. They noticed that statins tended to decrease heart attack and stroke rates even when the patient had started with a low LDL. So they started looking at this and started saying, wait a minute, there's something besides LDL going on. And maybe it's a thing they called inflammation. And so Paul Ridker's been going for 20-something years doing a lot of cardiovascular inflammation studies. One of the recent ones about 2 years ago was the Compass trial. He looked at one of the injectable anti-inflammatories, and sure enough, people that got these injectable anti-inflammatories, they were high level, very expensive, like $250,000 a year at that point. They did clinical trial and actually showed a decrease in heart attack and stroke from that type of anti-inflammatory. So then they started trying other anti-inflammatories. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories obviously didn't work. In fact, some of those increased heart attack and stroke risk. They looked at, was it colchicine? One of the other anti-inflammatory drugs. That didn't work either. So he's off on his quest, trying to find an anti-inflammatory drug that makes sense, that decreases heart attack and stroke risk. And hopefully he'll get there. Karen Black, yes, 102 was what Quest put on my report. Karen, why don't you call Michelle and see if you can get a few minutes with me? We may want to. Because of that, it makes me wonder about the rest of the values. I don't think that you're gonna have that many high values in other places and you not have a problem. I clearly think you have a problem, but I'm worried about whether or not that number was correct. Chuck K, since childhood, type 1 diabetes was rare at the beginning of the century. Could it be that they have genetic predisposition to diet that causes the pancreas to fail? I think it's a good question. Clearly, it could be. I don't think anybody knows. Samaran Chowdhury, Father, good morning. Good morning to you, Mr. Chowdhury. And thank you very much, guys. This has been a lot of fun. We've gone on a little over an hour again. And again, a lot of interest in terms of diabetes. Thank you for that interest. Carl?